Thank you to everyone for joining the seminar today and being here to listen to us talk. As Hannah said, I'm Sara Dryhurst. I'm a research associate at the Winton Centre at the University of Cambridge. And I wanted to talk to you today about communicating risk and good risk communication. But I actually wanted to start my talk with an example of why I think good risk communication is so important. And this actually comes from a news story from a few years back. And this was in 1995, when the UK Committee on Safety of Medicines made an announcement that the third generation oral contraceptive pill doubles the rate of potentially fatal venous thrombosis. Now that sounds pretty scary, right? And of course, when this hit the headlines, it was really big. People were very fearful, and it had real consequences. So by the next year, by 1996, there were an additional 30,000 conceptions and 13,000 additional abortions. So these are serious consequences from this message. But that doubling of the risk, is it quite as scary as it sounds? Well, what are the absolute risks that we're dealing with here? So if we look at the old pill, that gives you a 1 in 7,000 chance of a blood clot. The new pill gives you a 2 in 7,000 chance of a blood clot. So the risk has doubled relative to what it was before, but the absolute risk in both instances is still very low. And I wonder if people would have had access to this additional information if they would have made different decisions. So relative risks here can be very, very misleading, and ideally then they should be presented alongside their associated absolute risk. But that then begs the question how to express these absolute risks themselves. And there are lots of different ways of doing this, and they have different effects on the reader. So think about these for yourself and how they make you feel. This statement, the 2010 Haiti earthquake killed 3,160 people out of every 100,000. The 2010 Haiti earthquake killed 3.16 people out of every 1,000. Well, the 2010 Haiti earthquake killed 3% of the Haitian population. Now, this is exactly the same risk. It's just expressed in a different way, and it feels different, right? And they, as I said, have different effects on the reader. There's been quite a lot of research on these types of perceptions. So this is a classic study from 1997 by Yamagishi, who asked their participants, which cancer death rate is higher? 1,286 out of 10,000, or 24.14 out of 100. So you can think your answer to yourself, and it might seem obvious, but the majority of participants in this study chose that first answer. So effectively, they were saying that a cancer death rate of 12.86% was higher than a death rate of 24.14%. And we think that the presence of the big number, the 1,286 versus 24.14, that may have confused people. And it's a phenomenon that we call denominator neglect. So people are ignoring the fact that the 1,286 is out of 10,000 and the 24.14 is out of 100. And they're just comparing those numerator numbers. So another example, participants here were asked, which bowl would you like to choose from? And again, you can choose your answer. So would you choose from a bowl that has 10 balls in it, where 1 is a winner, or a bowl that has 100 balls, where 7 are winners? Well, 53% of people chose the second option. So effectively, again, choosing a 7% chance of winning over a 10% chance of winning. And I think this final example is the most shocking for me. Which of these represents the biggest risk? 1 in 100, 1 in 1,000, or 1 in 10? Again, that might seem obvious to everyone here, but 25% of people, a quarter of people who were asked this question chose 1 in 1,000. So clearly, people are fundamentally misunderstanding these risk communications. And as I said, we think this is to do with this phenomenon called denominator neglect. So what can we do about it? In this instance, we'll keep the denominator the same when you want people to compare frequencies. So make sure it's out of the same number. So if people then ignore the denominator, it doesn't matter because the numerators in question are directly comparable. But as I said, clearly the way a number is presented can have a huge effect on people's perception of the risk. And the question then to ask is, well, why is that? And to answer that, we need to think about what risk actually is. And you might initially think of it as being a number, a probability, your risk of something is X%. But your perception of that risk is also very important, and it's highly variable. Different risks and different expressions of risk, as we've seen, feel different. And it's these feeling parts of our cognition, so what psychologists call affect, things like emotion, experience, people's worldviews, their trust. They're the most important factors for determining our perceptions of risk and our perceptions of the way that a risk is expressed. And in fact, these affective components are much more important than cold, hard facts about the risk itself. So more important than simply knowing about the risk or knowing its chance of happening. And in fact, we in the Winton Centre, we've been running some studies over the course of the pandemic examining exactly this. When it comes to COVID, for example, what are the most important predictors of people's risk perception? And we looked at a variety of factors, both psychological and demographic. And we found that those factors that were more to do with knowledge, so the cognitive factors, things like personal knowledge, how much someone knows about the virus, that was relatively low in terms of its relative importance in predicting people's risk perceptions. But these more affective components, so worldviews, direct experience, trust, they were much more important in determining people's risk perceptions of the virus. So as I said, these effects, or this effect, these feelings are key to how people perceive a risk. And we've already seen in our example before that by expressing numbers in different ways, we can change this feeling and we can potentially bias people's perception of that risk. So as communicators, we have quite a lot of power, and we have to use this power judiciously if we're to be trustworthy communicators, if we're to inform our audience to help them best understand the risk in question and thus empower them to take their own decisions, rather than to persuade them towards a particular point of view. So we've seen that showing absolute and relative risks together and keeping the denominator the same when you're communicating frequencies and you want people to compare between them, we've seen that that can help interpretations to be less biased and thus information to be more informative. But the question then is, is there anything else that we can do? Well, it might sound obvious, but use graphics to help understanding. A picture paints 1,000 words, right? Although, just look quickly at this graphic, this forecast for Hurricane Dorian that struck the United States at the end of 2019. And this is the cone of uncertainty used to communicate the path of the hurricane that you'll see in various forms all over the media. And I have a question for all of you, again, to think to yourself. If you were in Orlando, Florida right now, and you saw this forecast, would you evacuate? So you live in Orlando here, you turn on your TV, you see this forecast. Do you choose to evacuate? Well, there've been a few studies looking at exactly this, and 40% of people in these studies said that they wouldn't feel threatened if they were just outside the cone. Yet the hurricane forecasters expect the path of the hurricane to lie within the cone only 60 to 70% of the time. So 1 in 3 times, the hurricane will hit an area outside of the cone. So clearly this is not a good method of communication. One thing it is good for is for showing us that communications need to be empirically evaluated. We need to get to know who our audience are, what they want to know, and we need to work with them to develop communications, and we need to evaluate to make sure they understand. Test, test, test. So just thinking quickly back to the COVID risk perception study from before and our discussion of the affective components of risk perception, besides emotion, besides those feelings, another component of that affect is trust. And as communicators, we're often thinking to ourselves, how can we increase trust? Well, I wonder whether that question needs to be reframed. And Baroness Honora O'Neill, who is a member of the House of Lords and a philosopher in the UK, has some really nice ideas about this. And she actually says that organisations should not be aiming to increase trust. Rather, they should be aiming to demonstrate trustworthiness so that if people place their trust in them, they are worthy of that trust. And she says, in order to do that, we need intelligent openness about information. And what does intelligent openness mean? Well, she says that means the information needs to be accessible. So anyone, anywhere can access that information. So things like open access publishing can help that. But obviously, there are a huge number of other things that we need to do to make sure we fulfill that requirement. Information needs to be intelligible. So this is some of the stuff that we were talking about before, making sure that people understand the risk and minimizing their biases and their perception of it. But the information also needs to be usable. So we need to make sure that if people not just that people understand it, but that they can choose to take action and they have the efficacy, personal, collective, to do that. And the final point that she makes about intelligent openness is that information needs to be accessible. And that's the final point that I wanted to touch on with one final news story. And this is from the BBC from a few years back. And the headline here reads, UK unemployment falls to 1.44 million. So if we look at this story, it sounds okay. It comes from a good source, a trustworthy source, the BBC, and we have absolute numbers. So we know that the unemployment fell to 1.44 million, although we don't know what it fell from. But if we look at the byline underneath, we can see a little bit more detail. UK unemployment fell by 3,000 to 1.44 million in the 3 months to November, official figures show. Well, 3,000 doesn't sound very much, right? But it gets worse. So if you go to the source of the data, which is the Office for National Statistics in the UK, the ONS, you go to their website for the release of these data. You go to their methodology section, a series of very long documents. You find buried within that one paragraph that contains a very important sentence. And that sentence says that there was a small fall of 3,000 with a 95% confidence interval of plus or minus 77,000. Plus or minus 77,000. So unemployment might have gone up, it might have gone down, we simply cannot tell. And so the uncertainty around this number was key to the story and how much faith we should put in it and in the numbers themselves. Think about a decision that you're basing on the facts put before you. You need to know how much to trust each fact. Is it an estimate or is it an actual count? If it is an estimate, how certain or uncertain are we about that estimate? Despite its importance, however, uncertainty that is, in informing decisions, many scientists and policymakers are reluctant to communicate it, to be upfront about it. They cite concerns that it might overwhelm audience attention or undermine understanding or undermine trust. But at the Winton Centre, we wanted to know, well, what's the evidence for this? Let's evaluate this. What are the effects of communicating uncertainty on people's understanding and on their levels of trust? And we've run quite a few studies on this, but I just wanted to leave you with the results of one study that we've been doing more recently. And this was testing a variety of graphical formats, graphical representations of uncertainty about trends, about things like election polling data here on the left, which is a study we did with the BBC, and then some COVID death rate data more recently in Italy and in the UK. And we wanted to see whether communicating uncertainty information in these various forms, so a kind of scatter chart, an error bar, we tested lots of different formats, whether it did actually undermine people's understanding and undermine their perceptions of the trustworthiness of the information, compared to these controls where we didn't have any uncertainty presented at all. So what did we find? Well, no effect. So presenting uncertainty around trends in this instance did not compromise participants' objective comprehension, and it didn't undermine perceptions of trustworthiness of the data or trustworthiness of the data producers. And in fact, there was some indication that uncertainty gave increased nuance to people's interpretation of these trend lines, so a positive potentially of communicating uncertainty there. So perhaps I think going forward, we can be more muscular in our presentations of uncertainty, provided the effects of our communications are evaluated. So I just wanted to do a quick summary of what I've been talking about, hints towards good risk communication based on this talk. So be aware of the importance of how risk is perceived. There's a great quote from Paul Slovic: risk does not exist independent of our minds and culture. Always use absolute risks, never just relative risks on their own. And when you're using frequencies, keep the denominator the same. Use graphics to illustrate numbers, but evaluate, be that graphics, be that text, be that numerical forms of risk communication. Evaluate, work with the audience to make sure that you're providing them the information they need and they want in a way that they understand. As I said before, test, test, test. Be upfront about your uncertainties if you can, and aim not to be increasing trust, but to be demonstrating trustworthiness. Well, that's it. Thank you.
That's perfect. Thank you, Sarah. And so now that Sarah has outlined some of the hints towards good risk communications and the issues that we need to consider when we're communicating, which can affect people's perceptions to risk, we now have Sara McBride, who's going to talk about some of the practical realities of communication in the field. So Sara is a research social scientist at the United States Geological Survey. So thank you very much for getting up so early to speak to us today. And she has years of experience as a professional communicator and researcher, predominantly working for science and emergency management organizations. So Sara McBride, if you would like to start sharing this.
Thank you. Sara, that was such a fantastic presentation. I feel a bit bad having to follow up your wonderful work. It's always such an honor. Thank you so much for inviting me. So I'm going to talk a little bit about practice and research and where some of these complications come in, because of course, applying research without being thoughtful of the cultural and social context in which you're applying it in can lead to very marginal and bad results. So just a little bit about me. I lived in the South Pacific, particularly New Zealand, for about 16 years. And I worked for GNS Science, and I worked a lot of, pretty good sized events or disasters within New Zealand. I was the public information manager, second in command for Christchurch, working for the New Zealand government. I was the public information manager for GNS Science, GeoNet for the magnitude 7.8 Kaikoura earthquake. I have worked a Category 5 cyclone in Fiji, a FEMA declared disaster area in Hawaii when I was living there. I worked on the H1N1 flu pandemic, on a volcanic eruption, a couple of them, including White Island in 2016. And Waikari White Island in 2016. I was also the chief of operations for the US Geological Survey in Puerto Rico last year for that earthquake. And just a little, that's kind of what I did before I was a researcher. So this is my little slide on Aotearoa, New Zealand. I'm sure many of you on the phone already know Aotearoa, New Zealand. But just quickly, that's sort of where I lived for a long time. And I always have to put this slide up just to make clear that the lessons I learned in New Zealand don't automatically apply everywhere else. New Zealand is a very unique culture, and it includes diverse cultures there. And so applying these things directly are a little bit challenging. But while I was living there, the Christchurch earthquake had happened. And I was the public education, public information manager for the emergency management agency there within the region of Canterbury, which is where Christchurch is. And I remember I had worked on booklets and brochures and roadshows about earthquakes to try to get the community to understand what was going on in terms of potential seismic risk in that area. And people would grab the brochures. We did testing. We did biannual surveys to view people's perceptions on what the risk was. And every year that we did the market surveys, 92 to 93% said, yes, we absolutely think an earthquake could happen and affect us in our lifetime in the Canterbury region. So we thought, okay, great, we're doing a really good job. And then this earthquake happens, and many earthquakes happened in Christchurch. It just hit a period of seismic activity. And the predominant narrative came out, well, no one told us this could happen here. No one told us this could happen to us. And immediately I sort of felt overnight like I was the most failed risk communicator in all of New Zealand, right? Because there was this growing feeling that the public had not been adequately warned about the seismic risk. And so when I started the PhD and my research, I came from a place of sort of anger about it. I was like, why are people so dumb? Like, why can't they understand what we're telling them? Why aren't they reading the booklets? Why aren't they going to the websites? Like, what is wrong with people? And in the end of the dissertation, I came out with the understanding that, oh my God, actually one of the reasons that is wrong is that we actually, as scientists and emergency managers and communicators, are actually pretty terrible at communicating risk on a meaningful level to our communities. We use jargon, we focus on issues that we're interested in and not what the community is interested in. We do these 16-page brochures on seismic risk. And when I did readability studies on these documents, they were around 18 to 19 years old on readability. So a large portion of the population really wouldn't necessarily be able to engage with the content in a meaningful way. So I learned a lot of lessons from that, and I began to apply my lessons there globally, particularly in the United States. I came back and took a Mendenhall Fellowship with the US Geological Survey. So my communication attempts had failed, and I really wanted to understand why. And this is my badge, by the way, that I had when I entered the EOC. I used to wear really high heels in the disaster area just to make people laugh and to lighten the mood. And the staff loved it so much that they made me this badge of my shoe. And that was how I got into all of the red zone areas. So I don't share this badge with many people, but it is like, I still have it 10 years later. So a couple of things. So do all social behavioral sciences agree? So when I was approaching my dissertation, I thought, look, I'm going to look at communication research and emergency management research and sociology and public health and psychology and linguistics and human geography. And in the center of this will be fundamental universal knowledge about risk and crisis communication that I can use going forward. And in fact, it wasn't at all like that. It was much more like this. The disciplines do not agree. They fight with each other. You know, one discipline is like, no, it's culture. And another discipline is, no, it's the social structure. Another one is, no, it's cognitive. No, it's, you know, it's what's coming out of your brain. So there's these disagreements within social science. And I don't need to tell you guys this. I'm sure you're very well aware of this issue. And so it's, as a researcher, it can be intimidating to approach this vast body of knowledge that is not necessarily connected or engaged with each other. I found this map in Griffin's book really useful in terms of mapping the disciplines. Here, I just really wanted to quickly go over it, that, you know, you have the social psychological and you have the social cultural and the critical. So Sara Dryhurst probably fits more in like the social psychological frame, and I would hang out with the sociocultural and critical theorists. But Sara and I are still friends, and like we talk to each other and we work together. And that to me is really important, that you can be looking at an issue from various perspectives, and each perspective, each research piece just enriches the knowledge that you're trying to gain. And so I just wanted to show the map of how I came to terms with this disparate knowledge, that it's okay to have different territories that you are associated with. So some of the models that I use when I'm approaching my work and applying practice and research to practice is, I look at the heuristics processing model. The core orientation model of communication is around relationships, which I use a lot. I use excellence theory from Grunig, which is sort of the PR communication side of it. I even use the classic Berlo theory, which is source message channel receiver. It's just a real fundamental bits and pieces of communication theory. And then participatory communication model, and then inoculation theory is probably one of my favorites as well. Just quickly on one of them that I use a lot is the heuristics systematic model of information processing. So it's more around, and this is particularly true in crisis. When people are in crisis and they're traumatized, they have less energy to mentally digest complex information. So keeping things simple is really critical. And I'll give a good example of this. There's a bushfire in Australia, and there was evacuation centers, and there was a guy who was helping people out with telephones. And he came in and he had a big belt of different models of telephones. And he said, you know, if you guys have a Nokia 3310, come talk to me about this. If you have an iPhone 5, come talk to me about this. If you have an Android, if you have a Samsung, talk to me about this. And he listed all the different kinds of phones, and nobody would talk to him. And the next day he came in to the evacuation center and he said, if you want to talk about phones, I can talk to you about phones. I'm here to talk to you about your phone. And he totally shifted in a day how he was talking about it. He was going from very complex, or what people would normally understand, to very general. And then people actually started talking to him. So we need to understand that simplicity is really key in terms of crisis. And numbers alone are not going to be persuasive for people. That's critical. It's critical to get the numbers right, but it's also critical to talk about other things than just numbers. So just quickly on a case study that I work on, which is on Aftershock Forecast. This is a quick study on Bombay Beach. So Bombay Beach was a swarm that happened in 2016 in Southern California. We had a bunch of earthquake swarm activity, and swarms in that area can lead to bigger earthquakes like San Andreas earthquake. So people get really nervous when they see the Bombay Beach thing. And we put out an aftershock forecast, which is a probabilistic forecast of what could happen in the future based on how the behavior of that aftershock sequence is going, or that sequence is like the earthquakes are going. compared to all the thousands of different ones we have in our database. So we put out this aftershock forecast, and it was late. It was 2.5 days late after, if you see in this area, this was when the seismic activity occurred. And here's when we finally got our media release out. 2.5 days late, seismic activity had pretty much already passed. The risk was pretty much over. The media picked it up a couple of days later, ran with it, and it became a real mess for the USGS. So what instead was, we built a template, and I'm sorry this is so small, but we start very simply. We start, be ready for more earthquakes. More earthquakes than usual, called aftershocks, will occur near the main shock. When there are more earthquakes, the chance of a larger earthquake is greater. That means the chance of damage is greater. So we start very simply. We don't put any numbers in the first bit. And then we go into what we think will happen next. And then we go the earthquake related aftershocks. Now there's no visuals here, and there will be. We're developing the visuals right now. But what we did was we compared the media, and we did an analysis of media articles on Bombay Beach with the template, with the non-template advisory that was very sort of confused, to this. And what we found was, we had much better pickup from the media. The media was just replicating our words because our words were written in AP English. They were catered to the media. And we found that we were frequently and rapidly quoted directly in the media. And most media expressed probabilities of chance, which was consistent with our template and with what we had been told by social scientists, including myself. Then we talked about the combined presentation of expected numbers and probabilities kind of likely caused confusion. So we've now separated those things. The media added their own words to further interpret lower probabilities, but not as much as we had seen in Bombay Beach. So we saw real success moving forward in terms of that. So just quickly on another study that was done on there on aftershock forecasts, maps and narratives and tables and numbers. These are all things that people need and want during that time. But make sure it's a tiered approach. Go simple first, and then increase your level of complication, because you're not just talking to the people who are traumatized in the area, you're also talking to people who are concerned outside the area and who are wanting to know more information, and they're wanting to digest what's going on as well. So there's a level for complication you can do there, but always offer the simplest first in terms of your tiered approach. And we also found that people aren't stupid, and I'm sorry to make that joke about, you know, when I started with the Christchurch earthquake, people are diverse and intelligent, and they're really interested in technical information, but maybe not for the reasons that we assume. Wine found that the group of people who experienced the Canterbury earthquake sequence valued aftershock forecasts, even if they didn't understand it. Even if they didn't know what it meant, they valued that someone was actually trying to communicate this information to them. And they found that science was comforting, that they used this information as a comfort for them when they were very stressed. So just quickly, you know, two-way communication, asymmetrical and symmetrical, which is sort of excellence theory here. Now that we have social media, we have much more chance to have conversations with people online, which is fantastic. So if you ever have a chance to go onto online platforms and communicate with people in a two-way, that is helping you create a relationship with people. If you have a relationship with people, they're more like the trustworthiness, they're more likely to find you trustworthy if you're relatable and accessible. So that is really critical. Be where the people are, find out where their channels are, and the use of language and structure. With the Bombay Beach study, I was told USGS Earthquakes was likely not to have a social media account. And I said, no, we need one. And then I went and I did the study, and I showed the differences between having a social media account and not having a social media account. And now we have a USGS Earthquakes account because of the research that I was able to illustrate to my management around the power of research. And then are people, you know, what kind of tone and style are you using on Twitter and Facebook and Reddit? Each of these different social media platforms obviously has a different culture, and what works on Reddit absolutely does not work on Twitter, and what works on Twitter may not always work on Reddit. So understanding the currency and fluency that people are using is really important. And so learn the tone and style of the culture of that channel before diving in. Make sure that if you're thinking about these things, you're really thoughtful about it. Always use personal stories, and I think people talk about this all the time. Personal narratives and stories, they're considered best practice, showing relatability and humanity during this time. of crisis, I think, is always incredibly important. It warms people. It lets you know, like, hey, I'm an individual too. I'm stressed too. I understand what is happening, and you know, you're not alone in this experience. So what does work? How do we encourage people? Being the science friend, in my mind, is really where we want to be. If we're like an agency, like I am at the USGS, really looking at how we can be more accessible. When I talk about the USGS, I like to think of the USGS, if it was an agency, I would like to think of it as that uncle that you have at a dinner party with your family, who's kind of quiet and relaxed and doesn't necessarily say a lot, but then you ask them a question about their work and suddenly they're in and you can't get them to stop talking and they're super excited. That's what I think about the USGS and how it can be more relatable. So I tend to think about agencies as people rather than as agencies. Like, what would they be in relationship to you? You want to have multiple science voices that are important. So local, national, international. One spokesperson is not sufficient. We saw this in Christchurch, where we had a local scientist who was a paleoseismologist digging out his backyard and showing silts and soils in his backyard and what was going on there. And then we had the national scientists who were talking from the national agency perspective. And then we had international scientists also weighing in. Some people are going to trust the international scientists more. Some people are going to trust the local more, and some people are going to trust the national more. So having all three of those groups is important. Encourage preparedness as a community effort and not just individuals. This is really hard in the United States because the United States is a very individualistic culture, no doubt. And we frame our preparedness in that. But we also know that if communities prepare as a group, they are much more likely to come out of an event positively than in a negative frame just as individuals. And then, so the template thing. So be prepared to communicate by setting up standardized messages beforehand. Having messages pre-approved is actually really important. With my agency, I worked on an advisory before we had the template, which I wasn't sold on the template idea, by the way, at the beginning. This got me sold. It was a little event that occurred in Idaho, and it took us 9 days to get that information out to the public because so many people wordsmithed it and wanted to perfect it and wanted to make it this perfect thing. And everybody wants to play around with words. Everybody wants and thinks that they know how to write better. So having a standardized pre-agreed template really does help in terms of getting the media information out there as quickly as you can. So getting that done. And that's one thing that I've learned through this process about working with larger agencies, is having that standardization is really important. So conclusion, I use a lot of humor in my work. I always have a cat in every single one of my presentations. I know 2020 and 2021 has been a ride and a difficult ride. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening to me. I'm sure you guys are all sick to death of listening to risk communication and crisis communication stories and what to do and what not to do. It has been on everybody's mind and is a huge, huge topic. So the thing about communication research, it indicates that there's several ways to encourage people to communicate with you. So make sure that you are doing this, if you can, this one way. And that's hard if you're working for a big national agency, to be open and transparent, but that is what the research indicates we should try to do. Likability and relatability are really major factors in good communication. So if you're likable, if you're relatable, you're gonna have a better time in terms of creating a relationship with people. And using different ways to communicate. I use humor all the time. Humor works great when appropriate. And I have a paper that I've just finished on humor research, so I'm excited to share that when it comes out. Sometimes we're our own worst enemy. Don't stand in the way of communicating. I find that the hardest part of my job oftentimes is getting the scientists to get on board with what I want to communicate. They want to make it more technical. They want to make it more complicated. They want to make sure that they have completeness rather than a general overview. And that to me has been a huge challenge. So sometimes just simple is okay. Get out of your own way when communicating. And look, I have failed. If you're reading this and you're thinking, oh God, I do this all the time, I suck. I promise you I have failed more epically than anyone on this phone call. Well, I hope so. Maybe there's a few of you going, oh yeah, I did that really badly. So I failed, so you don't have to. So please, I hope that this talk has been useful for you. And if you have failed before, don't worry, everyone fails in communication. It is just inevitable that you're going to make mistakes. So just be patient with yourself and kind with yourself, and understanding that you can only take people as far as they're willing to go. So anyway, that's my talk. I hope it was useful.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much. It was just really clear and so informative. And I think it's really good that you're now followed by Shauna, because a couple of things that you mentioned, you talked about the social media account for USGS, and then you also talked about different disciplines. So Shauna's coming from another discipline, and she's actually going to be talking about misinformation. So a bit of information about her. So she's a research associate at the Centre for Arts and Social Sciences and Humanities at the University of Cambridge. And she's an interdisciplinary researcher working across experimental psychology, computer science, and linguistics. And her research interests focus on interactional accounts of how informational and opinionated content is communicated. So yeah, as I mentioned today, Shauna is going to be talking about misinformation to us. So over to you.
Okay, I'll just share my screen. There we go. Okay, so hello everybody. Yes, I'm Shauna. Thank you for the introduction, Hannah, and thanks for those brilliant talks, Sarah and Sarah, which really nicely set it up, because I think you've covered a lot there about how how we can aim to be communicators and the different strategies we can use for communicating uncertainty risk, and how we can build those relationships so that we can engage in those really substantive discussions with people and allow a space where people can express unknowingness and build knowledge forward. And what I'm going to talk about here is a little bit of a side angle, but to try and contextualize it into the kind of wider ecosystem of information. And yeah, Sarah started talking about how science communicators can engage with communities using the platforms that they use. And I'm going to, I guess, try and complicate that a little bit to show some of the challenges that are arising in that area. As Hannah said, yeah, I'm not explicitly a disaster researcher, but I am interested in communication, and most of the work I've done has been about computer-mediated communication, particularly in social media contexts. So that's kind of the angle I'm coming from. Need to work out how to, there we go. So just as first of all, a bit of context, as I'm sure all of you are aware, the way in which we access information online has changed, where we get our information from, how we decide what is a trustworthy source, what is valid and informative, is shifting constantly. And this little infographic really is just demonstrating that this is from 2018. The Reuters digital news report highlighted that people now, I think it's 65% have this side door access, which means gathering news information from indirect sources. So rather than going to where previously people would have certain newspapers that they would go to get information, it's coming in a much more distributed way across you going into a search engine and what's the latest on the US elections, and then bringing up different sources of information. So there's not the same kind of filtering of information, and 23% coming from social media, and that's even higher for under 35s. So there's very different, and there's a lot of variation between individuals, but essentially the information that people are gathering to find out about current events, etc., is coming from different channels, a multiplicity of different channels, which are not structured in the same sense of trusted authorities that have been pre-selected. Stop that thinging. In the current context of, so particularly I'll be talking in relation to COVID-19, as that is what, well, everyone's been dealing with for the last while, but also we've been, together with Hannah, we've been looking at some of information circulation on Twitter in particular in relation to COVID-19 around certain things such as mask wearing and use. But the situation in a crisis context or a disaster context, there is obviously an increase and appetite for information, for good quality information from trusted sources, and this is nothing new. But in the absence of clear communication, people obviously work with the networks and communities that they are part of to exchange information. And social media has been used in a really positive way. Actually, in the examples, there's been, you know, where in response in the aftermath of disasters, people setting up networks to help locate missing people, or share information on shelters, etc. And you see this mobilization and how that's kind of changed in digital contexts. But equally, what we have at the minute, and what the WHO has termed as the infodemic, is that we have access to these much more distributed communities. It's not just your neighbours, your family or friends or particular individuals. It's a much broader group of sources from which information comes. And there is an awful lot of information. And it is humanly impossible to always ascertain what is good and reliable and what is not, and which information we should trust and we should not. Sorry, I'm gonna have to stop pressing that button. Okay. So the World Health Organization kind of flagged pretty early on that there was the potential for misinformation in this context. I think in February, they were already talking about fake news and it potentially having being as even more of a problem than the virus itself in the way that it spreads. So in response to this hunger for information, we have people turning to social media more. There was a surge in social media usage and uptake. This is just showing a little bit of the peak in people talking about coronavirus and COVID and how it picked up as it became more of a global issue. But in general, people were spending more time reading news articles and were generating a lot more. So I think there was a 34% increase in the number of monetizable users in Twitter in that first quarter of 2020 compared to the year before. So there's generally more people going on and searching for information and looking for it.
Big boost in the number of people on Twitter.
What, sorry? Could you repeat that? Sorry, I didn't hear.
Apologies, I don't know if that was an accident or not. So if you unmute yourself, I think just carry on, Shauna.
Okay. And what's kind of become apparent in this context and the types of misinformation and disinformation that have been circulated during the pandemic is that there are different types. So disinformation is typically strategically attempting to deceive users or misinform, whereas misinformation can be well-meaning individuals who happen to share information that is unfounded and unverified. In a study looking at the types of information that was being shared on Twitter, the Reuters report found that 87% actually was based on a truth. So there was an element of truth within it, and then there's a layering of reconfiguration, recontextualization, where the information is then configured. So you often get this sort of layering of, facts with fiction, and you'll get, real graphs used, but the information presented around it to create this kind of deception. And purely fabricated information is much less common. The other factor you have is obviously individuals who have greater access to wider audiences. So there have been cases where politicians and but also public figures, celebrities, passing on information that they think newsworthy, or just very quickly endorsing an idea that then gets disproved. So the status of the speaker, the trust that they have, obviously influences the way in which that information is taken. So what were platforms doing about it? In May, Twitter, there were a couple of joint statements from the kind of big ones, Facebook and Twitter, and generally looking at ways of scaling up their content moderation, really, to start addressing how misinformation is dealt with. So they used a tiered approach. This is Twitter's approach. They have this propensity for harm, severe and moderate, and then categories of labels from sort of misleading to disputed to unverified claim. And partly they were doing content removal, and this kind of intersects with a lot of work around how, freedom of speech, how do you, individuals' rights, who gets to decide what is good quality information or not. And there was a lot of voicing from the social media platforms about the degree to which they are positioned to do fact checking, while you have other organisations such as Full Fact and Pointers who were doing fact checking and trying to link it up. But you had it kind of happening in these separate silos and it not always being quite as connected. And because of the scale and the speed and the spread, there's a lot of pressure on doing automated approaches to fact checking, which is great, but is extremely difficult. So trying to, you need a database of facts, of verified truths against which to fact check against, and then there is all the multiplicitous different ways that individuals construct sentences, which can, including especially humour, sarcasm, which make it all the more difficult to ascertain what someone's saying and really attempt to verify that. And more fundamentally, once a post is flagged as misinformation and that's been verified and then it's removed, it's already been seen by many people. And one example, there was an article on Medium that within 24 hours had been read by more than 2 million people and shared in 15,000 tweets in 24 hours. And there's a lot of research that shows that once individuals have been exposed to false claims, it's very difficult to undo that, and especially if it is appearing multiple times, exposure bias, and people are more likely therefore to think, oh, I've already seen that, it's more likely to be true. So there's a number of different factors that start feeding into how we deal with that. And even once a claim has been disproved, that doesn't necessarily mean someone will alter their underlying attitudes that have been informed based on it. I think I've done that already. And then other things I think were interesting that's worth kind of just flagging up here is other approaches to how you deal with this. So the World Health Organization created a Facebook chatbot. So, I mean, it was a very kind of restricted, rudimentary kind of chatbot where you had to pick a particular topic to talk about. It doesn't really resemble dialogue in a natural form, but it did enable a kind of verified, you can talk about these specific topics. So I think it's quite interesting looking these ways. I mean, there's a lot of research that shows discussion and deliberation and our real-time fact checking, how you do that, it helps improve people's understanding and can robustly check the facts and assumptions. So thinking about more dialogue-based approaches to that is interesting. I think there's also challenges associated with that. So yeah, I think the few things just to probably kick off the discussion going forward is the empirical evaluation of these strategies that are used. So with the so the Twitter, the content moderation and pulling and suspending of platforms, there's a couple of things there. Platforms don't really want to, they derive business from people being on their platform and sharing newsworthy content, and especially if everyone's talking about it and it's a provocative item, that's kind of all the better. But when the strategies in terms of moderation, if something's got a label over it saying don't read, this is possibly unverified, there've been relatively limited studies that look at how users respond to that, about how they view it afterwards. I mean, there's some work showing that flagging of content, but there needs to be more work kind of investigating what is the impact on users of this. I think there's a lot of work that could be done in the role that counter narratives played, and it'd be very interesting to speak to Sara about when she's talking about communicators getting on and talking with communities on the platforms that they're in the style that's used. But there are obviously a lot of different ways that we can construct counter narratives or counter claims, and there's some research that looks at how different strategies are more or less successful in convincing people to think otherwise. And I think there's a lot of questions around how information provenance is kind of built into system architectures and how that's kind of flagged and moved forward. So yeah, I'll leave that there.
That was great, thank you, Shauna. I think I will just respond sort of based on my own work, and then because time is, I know some people might have to leave at 5, we'll just open the floor straight up to questions, and then they can have a chat as well. And so just as sort of a note, one of the bits I found interesting across all of the talks was sort of you all mentioned the notion of trust, and it's just some of the phrases which I picked up on was, I think that it was Sara McBride talked about science as the source of comfort, and then Sara Dryhurst talked about intelligent openness. And sort of I've been doing a bit of work in, as Shauna mentioned, with the pandemic as well, and looking at expertise under pressure. And we noticed, as did many people at the beginning of the pandemic, there was sort of this rhetoric that we're following the science, and people were then calling for what is this science that you're talking about? And there were these calls for transparency. And it actually forced sort of SAGE to change the way that they're working and release the names of the experts and release the minutes, because people wanted to see what they were talking about. And now actually, if you look at the sort of briefings which happened later on, sort of there's at least an acknowledgement now that it's not just the science which is sort of making these decisions, it's sort of a mixture of politics as well and the economics. And I thought that was an interesting change just observed from the pandemic. And then also, Shauna, you were talking about where the information comes from. And as you mentioned, we've been working on a project about sort of how people are talking about face masks on Twitter and what information is being circulated. And one of the things that we've noticed is there is quite a large amount of people still referring to sort of unregulated news outlets, and then also some of the top voices in terms of retweets are those from conspiracy theorists. So it's just interesting how you need to balance that against sort of the official voices, which sort of Sara McBride mentioned, and also Shauna in terms of the World Health Organization and USGS. So there are just a couple of sort of my own sort of observations and thoughts. But I think the best thing to do now is, if anyone in the audience has any questions, perhaps just write in the chat that you've got a question, and then you can unmute yourself and put your video on and ask it. Or if you prefer to write it in the chat, I can read it out for you.